So, today I'm going to share a little bit about my journey navigating the process of getting into an Ivy League school. I ultimately attended Princeton University where I studied economics and finance, but hopefully, by sharing my story, you can get a little bit of insight on how to fulfill the steps required to get into the school of your dreams. When I was in fifth grade, that was actually the first time I touched an SAT book. In fact, I started memorizing SAT vocab for the verbal section. Back then, they only had the math and verbal, and so the verbal was actually quite difficult for a high school student, much less a fifth grader. Some of you might think this is crazy, why is this fifth grader picking up an SAT book? It's because I had big sights and big goals to get into a top school. I was raised in a household of tiger parents who really pushed me to succeed, and I owe a lot of that credit to my mom. When I was in fifth grade, I studied primarily because I wanted to qualify for the Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth program. And so I studied really hard. And by the time I became an eighth grader, I scored a perfect 800 on the SAT math, and only 30 students in the entire country scored a perfect score. My SAT score was a 630 on the verbal and an 800 on the math for a total of 1430 in eighth grade. Keep in mind, this is above the norm, primarily because I was just constantly drilling myself on the SATs. By the time I entered high school, that's really when everything changed. I was a strong student because I had already gone through that SAT prep, but I knew there was a lot more that you had to do to get into a top school. I started studying the art of problem solving books. I started taking a rigorous course load of APs. At my high school, you can take AP Physics and AP European History as early as sophomore year, and so I took the most rigorous courses at my high school. Eventually, I went on to get the National AP Scholar Award, which awards students who got 8 APs or more with scores of 4s and 5s. In high school, I was another STEM kid. So I was really strong in math and science, but I knew that in order to stand out, I really had to rise above the pack. And so what I did was I studied for the US National Chemistry Olympiad, primarily because I was taking AP Chemistry as a junior. I also took AP Physics as sophomore, but my school did not offer the F equals MA or the Physics Olympiad. And so I knew that in order to stand out, the US National Chemistry Olympiad was a way to go. And so I started studying really hard for that exam. I knew that getting a 4.0 GPA and top SAT scores, I eventually got a 1580 on my SATs, just wasn't enough to separate myself from the rest of the pack. In fact, when I took it, the SATs was out of 2400, so I personally got a 2340 out of 2400 on the SATs. 780 reading, 760 on the writing, and a perfect 800 on the math. In addition, I also attended the UCSB Research Mentorship Program. I did a research project during my junior year called the inhibition of the misfolding of the Alzheimer's amyloid beta protein using M-methylated peptides. And this was a research project that I conducted at the UCSB Research Mentorship Program. It's still in existence to this day. It roughly has a 10% acceptance rate. And I submitted this research project to the Siemens Westinghouse competition. This is for the top 300 high school researchers in the country. It's essentially the equivalent of the Regeneron Science Talent Search today. I was top 500 in the country on the US National Chemistry Olympiad, top 300 in the country in the Siemens Westinghouse competition. And so because of that, I knew my academic profile was stronger than the rest of the students just based on my STEM accolades. I also received the Caltech Signature Award for Math, Science, and Technology back in high school, where the Nobel Prize laureate Kip Thorne actually gave me a book on Stephen Hawking's The Origins of the Universe. And it was a signed book by Kip Thorne. I knew that even in high school, I was very strong in STEM. In addition, I founded a nonprofit called Amnesty International. That was a local chapter at my school where we fight for humanitarian rights in Darfur, and we wrote letters to prisoners of conscience. If you look at my profile, I had a really strong leadership position in Amnesty International. I was also president of the Community Service Council. I played varsity basketball. I was part of the radio talk show at my school. I was involved in Mu Alpha Theta and also the American Red Cross. Back in high school, I had a pretty stacked profile, and I knew that in order to compete with these other kids that I had to go above and beyond. When I applied in high school, one thing I did overlook was the importance of the personal statements. When I applied early, I actually applied early to Harvard, my personal statements weren't that good. And so I actually didn't take my personal statements very seriously at the time. And so I applied early at Harvard, and actually Stanford's application was due at that same time. It was due a little bit earlier. And so that was probably my biggest mistake, which is, I didn't take the personal statements very seriously despite having a stacked profile. So needless to say, I didn't get into Harvard and Stanford, but I did have another shot to get into other schools, because once I found out that I got rejected from Harvard on December 15th, I had a chance to rewrite all of my essays. Nothing about me personally changed. My parents even hired a college consultant to help me and repackaged my entire application. So that's when I realized that your application is ultimately what they see. You could have a 4.0 GPA, National AP Scholar, National Merit Semifinalist, U.S. National Chemistry Olympiad, founder of Amnesty International, and all of these accolades that I had, but you still won't get in if your essays are weak. And so I completely rewrote my essays. I repackaged my application with the help of a college consultant that my mom hired. And fortunately, I was ultimately admitted to Princeton University, which was ranked #1 on the US News and World Report. I also got to Caltech, and between Princeton and Caltech, I just thought Princeton was a better fit for me, primarily because I was always ambitious and I just wanted to go to the #1 ranked school. This experience is not atypical. If you have your sights on like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, or MIT, like these top 5 schools, a 4.0 GPA and a 1600 SAT score just isn't enough. You just have to do so much more. Even back then, when I was in high school, which was well over 20 years ago, I had to do so much more to get in. So this is what I think a lot of parents and students overlook, is that they don't understand the level of depth and breadth that you need to capture in the application to really get into the top schools. And so if you're watching this and you need additional guidance or confidence in your application, don't hesitate to book a call with us. We're more than happy to analyze your profile, and we'll give you a realistic assessment of whether your profile is good enough to get into the top schools. So I really think that's a misconception. A lot of parents think, oh, my child has a 4.0, he's got a 1600 SAT score and he's gonna get into like Harvard or Yale. And that's so far away from the case. You need a leadership organization, school clubs, a published research paper, attending competitive summer programs and regional national awards, whether it's the Siemens Westinghouse competition, which I did. That's no longer available today, but they do have the Regeneron Science Talent Search, or it could be the Scholastic Art and Writing competition, or the USA Chemistry or Physics Olympiad. And so we will give you the exact milestones on what you need to accomplish to get in. In fact, when we consult with students, we consult by starting off with the entire 10-page roadmap, which outlines everything that you need to do to get into these schools. And so a little bit about my journey is you definitely have to work hard, and you have to be one of the top students in the country if you really want to have the best shot at getting in. I knew I was going to get into a top 5 school because obviously I was already one of the top 300 to 500 students in STEM in the country. And so because of that, if you think about it, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, each class size is around 1,600 students. So they really want the best of the best. And so if you want to get into the top schools, you also need to have an incredible profile. I also say that one approach, a student who has fewer awards could have many APs. For example, if you don't have as many awards and you're a little bit worried, you can accommodate for that by taking more AP exams. Some of my top students have taken anywhere between 10 to 12 AP exams, and they have had fewer awards, and that could still get you into a top school. So you really have to think in terms of probabilities and statistics. If you want to get into the top 5 schools schools in the country, you have to be one of the top students in the country. And I think that's something a lot of parents and students, they overlook. They think that a passion project or the essays or their 4.0 or 1600 SAT score is enough to carry them in, and that can't be farther from the truth. So if you had anything to learn about getting into an Ivy League school today, take from my personal experience. You definitely want a stacked profile. You also have to work hard and smart. And so we as college admissions consultants will guide you through every step of the way and give you the right blueprint, strategies, and framework, as well as approach to navigate the college admissions process. We are consultants, mentors, and coaches who will guide you on getting into an Ivy League school. So if you like what we had to talk about today, and I hope you learned a little bit from my journey as well, then book a call with us and we'll see what we can do to help.